Both the United States and the Soviet Union have shot down civilian passenger planes. Today we're going to talk about why these situations have happened, and we're going to explain why. Ukraine is also quite responsible for what happened with Malaysian Airlines flight Malaysia Airlines 17, which was shot down in 2014 by pro-Russian militias in the Donbass. As we explained about a month ago in this video, in the Chicago Convention, it was the first time that common aeronautical laws were established for all countries, which expressly prohibited invading another country's airspace without permission, shooting down civilian planes, and similar points. But in the end, even though these things are prohibited, they have ended up happening. But when a commercial plane is shot down, most of the time it's because it is mistaken for an enemy aircraft or even an enemy missile. In a tense situation between two countries, with the uncertainty of what is approaching your territory, the decision is made to shoot down the aircraft, mainly out of fear that you are being attacked. And to show this, we're going to present two cases, one in which the Soviet Union decided to shoot down a commercial aircraft, and another in which the United States decided to shoot down a commercial aircraft. So you can see that with these things, there are no good guys or bad guys. These things are almost always mistakes. It's important to say that the complexity of these shootdowns is enormous. Much more than what we're going to be able to show you in these 15 minutes, in which we're going to cover several. That's why for those of you who know exactly what happened in each case, you'll notice that there are details we've decided to skip over, simply because there's not enough time. First, we'll talk about Korean Airlines Flight 007, which was shot down by the Soviet Union on September 1st, 1983. A Boeing 747-200 departed from New York bound for Seoul, the capital of South Korea, with a stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. Everything went smoothly until they landed in Anchorage and took off again. The aircraft took off heading north and was supposed to make a maneuver to then head towards Seoul, but this maneuver was not performed correctly, and the plane began to drift further and further off course with respect to the planned route. In the cockpit, no one noticed this small difference from the original route, so they continued as normal. And this is where the big coincidence comes in. It just so happened that at that moment there was an RC-135, a United States military aircraft that's about the same size as the Boeing. A 747 around the Kamchatka Peninsula, going in and out of Soviet airspace to monitor Soviet communications. But since the Korean Boeing 747 had strayed from its original route, it was heading toward the Kamchatka Peninsula without realizing it. Also, it just so happened that the RC-135 left radar range at the exact moment the Boeing 747 entered radar range. So the Soviets thought the commercial plane was actually the military plane, only this time it seemed to be heading directly toward a nuclear submarine base, so it was designated as a military target. And for that reason, they ordered the interception of the plane by 4 Mikoyan-Gurevich 23 fighter jets. However, they ran out of fuel before reaching it and let it go, since it was already out of radar range. However, the plane was now heading toward the south of Sakhalin Island, another Soviet territory that also happened to have a main base of the Soviet Union's fleet. And that's why, as soon as it was detected by radar, 2 Sukhoi 15S were sent to intercept it, and this time they did manage to get behind the Boeing 747, but let me remind you, it was nighttime, so they couldn't tell the difference between the Boeing 747 and the RC-135, which they were actually looking for, and what they did was fire a warning shot next to the aircraft. But again, it just so happened that the plane, at the moment the shots were fired, the plane started turning to the other side, and this made it so the pilots didn't see the bullets, and the Soviet fighter pilots took it as an evasive maneuver. Therefore, they decided to shoot it down with a K-8 infrared missile, which severely damaged the Boeing 747, ending the lives of the 269 people who were on board. Actually, if we look at the actions that should be taken in the event of an enemy incursion into the airspace, the Soviet Union said the following. You can't open fire on an intruding aircraft. The fighters must force the aircraft to land, and also in the next point, it says that the fighters must use warning shots first. If they don't comply, then the aircraft will be shot down, and that's exactly what happened. First, the Soviets pretended nothing had happened, as if everything was normal, until they realized that was completely unsustainable and changed their stance. But the conflict didn't escalate, even though it happened during a very tense moment in the Cold War. Because it was understood that it was a mistake, and like in all accidents, something was changed. And in this case, a point was added to the International Civil Aviation Organization regulation that prohibits the use of missiles in the interception of civilian aircraft. And it requires establishing communication first, either by radio or by light signals, and a standard was created with these signals. The second case we bring to this video is Iran Air Flight 655, shot down by the United States on July 6, 1988 in the Strait of Hormuz, ending the lives of 290 people. This flight originally covered the Tehran-Dubai route with a stopover in Bandar Abbas, an Iranian city located in the Strait of Hormuz. To put things in context, Iran and the United States were allies in the 70s. But at the end of this decade, with the revolution of 1979, there was a change of regime and ideology. They ended relations with the United States, and since then they became enemies. For that reason, even though today they are not allies, Iran still has American F-14S as fighter bomber aircraft because they were delivered in 1976 when they were allies. Well, the problem with this shootdown starts with the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. Any ship that wants to leave the Persian Gulf has to go through this strait. At that time, the war between Iraq and Iran was going on, and the tension in the Gulf was very high. You have to keep in mind that 20% of the world's oil has to pass through this strait. Given the hostilities that Iran frequently directed at tankers coming from Kuwait with oil, the United States escorted some of these tankers that had to cross the strait. And just a year earlier, missiles were fired at a United States frigate, killing several sailors. And that's why, after that incident, the United States officially announced that commercial planes flying over the area had to monitor 2 radio frequencies, one civilian and one military, in case any United States ship requested identification. But, as you may remember from the previous video, we mentioned that each country is sovereign over 12 nautical miles from its coast out to sea. Well, on the day of the incident, the United States had its ships in Iranian territorial waters because that day, the United States ship Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, was returning from an escort mission when an American helicopter reported gunfire from an Iranian barge, and therefore the Vincennes headed in that direction to confront them. At the same time, radar detected the A-300 from Flight 655 taking off from the city of Bandar Abbas. The problem is that it was mistaken for an Iranian F-14 that was heading straight toward them. Quickly, they started sending warnings over the previously mentioned military radio frequency, but the Iranian plane wasn't monitoring it. A total of 7 warnings were reported on this frequency, and in the end, they decided to send 3 more warnings on the civilian frequency. But there was no response. Let me remind you that from the Vincennes, they thought it was an Iranian F-14, and that's how they addressed it over the radio. Finally, the decision was made to launch 2 standard missile, 2 anti-aircraft missiles, which ended up shooting down the plane and killing everyone on board. There are several things that make the situation even more controversial. From the United States ship Vincennes, it was said that the F-14 was descending towards the ship as if it was going to attack them. However, the Airbus A300 was climbing since it had just taken off. Also, and here's where it gets complicated. The Americans knew that the Iranian F-14S no longer had air-to-surface missiles and, therefore, theoretically, could not fire at them. There was a small dispute about how to act knowing that information, but even so, from the Vincennes, it was decided to shoot down the aircraft. It is also said that the Vincennes, in the first place, acted very aggressively, going on the offensive against the Iranian barges, which did not pose much danger, and therefore entering Iranian territorial waters. And there is also no certainty about whether the American helicopter was actually fired upon, or if it was a confusion on the part of the helicopter crew. The Pentagon at first said that they had shot down an F-14, but hours later they corrected the statement and justified themselves, explaining that the Bandar Abbas airport is also used as a military base for F-14S. Besides, the aircraft did not identify itself, but of course it didn't because it wasn't equipped with systems to use military frequencies. And in the messages on the civilian frequency, it wasn't clear which plane was being asked to identify itself. On the other hand, from Iran it was said that the United States did it on purpose, even knowing it was a commercial aircraft, but that, in any case, even if it had been an F-14, they had no right to shoot it down, since they were in Iranian territorial waters. Thanks to recordings from the bridge of the United States ship Vincennes, you can see how the American sailors truly believed they were being attacked by an Iranian aircraft. As you can see, a real mess. But as I said at the beginning, I don't think there's a single government that would decide to shoot down a commercial aircraft. By the way, simply because it doesn't bring any benefit. And what you get in return are a lot of international problems, so if you weigh it up, it's never in any case going to be worth it. However, there have been times when commercial planes have been shot down on purpose, knowing it was a plane on purpose. But these attacks are not usually carried out by official governments. They're usually militias involved in some conflict. For example, in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, on November 22, 2003, when a group of Fedayeen, a paramilitary organization loyal to Saddam's government, tried to bring down a DHL Airbus A300 using a missile. Estrela, a Soviet man-portable air defense systems like the ones we talked about in the previous video. At that time, the invasion of Iraq was underway, and to reduce exposure to this type of attack, all aircraft, including civilian transport planes like this one, would climb very quickly after takeoff and follow a random heading so that an attack couldn't be planned in advance. However, in this case, it wasn't enough to avoid the missile impact. It severely damaged the left wing, causing a total loss of hydraulic power and also a fuel leak. With the aircraft's hydraulic systems out of service, the pilots had to fly using only the engines, by giving more or less power differentially to each side to turn, and by adding or reducing power symmetrically to climb or descend. Exactly the same thing that happened on United Airlines Flight 232, which we already discussed in detail in this video. Finally, they managed to land by flying the aircraft in this way, which is something completely incredible. They made a landing off the runway, but all 3 members of the flight managed to walk out on their own. But look at how the aircraft ended up. Something similar happened in Ukraine, but with a much worse outcome on Malaysian Airlines flight, Malaysia Airlines 17, in July of 2014, in which 298 people lost their lives, including 80 minors. It was the downing of a civilian aircraft in which the most people have lost their lives. To try to understand the situation, we have to remember that this happened in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk region, where in 2014 a military conflict was beginning between the Ukrainians and pro-Russian separatists. A conflict that in 2022 ended up turning into the current war that we all know. In March 2014, a few months before this accident, some airlines stopped flying over eastern Ukraine due to fears about the conflict. Since from the very beginning there were several shootdowns of military aircraft. But mainly, the shootdowns happened because of the use of man-portable air defense systems, and there was no information that there were more capable air defense systems in the area. That's why some airlines decided to continue with their routes, because, as we've already explained on the channel, changing a route can be very damaging for an airline. For purely economic reasons, what was done at the international level was to make clear the altitudes at which that area had to be flown over, with 26,000 and 32,000 feet being the minimum altitudes. Well, on July 17, 2014, Flight Malaysia Airlines 17, having departed from Amsterdam and heading to Kuala Lumpur, was near the border between Ukraine and Russia at an altitude of 33,000 feet. It had to divert north due to bad weather and flew over Donbass, where it was hit by an anti-aircraft missile near the cockpit, causing explosive decompression and splitting the fuselage into the front and rear sections, throwing the passengers out and making them fall from a height of 10 kilometers to the ground. Yes, you understood correctly. The plane broke apart in the air and the passengers fell individually to the ground. For this reason, the wreckage of the plane was also scattered over a very large area, making recovery efforts more difficult. The scene was so heartbreaking that those who live in the area and saw it say they literally saw bodies and pieces of the plane raining down from the sky. By analyzing the plane's black boxes, you can see that there were no problems during the flight, until suddenly the recording stopped. It can be said with complete certainty, even though Russia has denied it up to now, that the plane was hit by a 9M37 Buk missile, a Soviet missile. It is very likely that the pro-Russian separatists had it in their hands at the time of the accident. Russia, for its part, says that Ukraine also had this missile system. And they have even suggested that Malaysia Airlines 17 was shot down by a Ukrainian Sukhoi 25 with an air-to-air missile. Disclaimer, what you can see in this photo is not a Sukhoi 25, it's actually a MiG-29, but the Russians presented this photo and said that it was being attacked by a Sukhoi 25. It doesn't make any sense, of course, nobody believed them, it doesn't make sense. It's known that the plane was hit by a missile for several reasons. The first of these is that by looking at the wreckage found, like the parts of the cockpit, you can clearly see that it was pierced by projectiles with great kinetic energy. In other words, the shrapnel from a missile explosion. Pieces of these projectiles, with the same shape and material as those from a Buk missile, were also found inside the pilots' bodies and inside the cockpit. The other important point found by analyzing the cockpit audio recorders is a loud noise right before they stopped recording. There were 4 audio recorders in different positions inside the cockpit. And since this loud noise occurred at different times, can we assume the direction of the explosion in relation to the plane? This indicates that the direction of the missile possibly came from positions under the control of pro-Russian militias. Another point to mention is that Ukraine was heavily criticized internationally for not closing its airspace in 2014. Because if they had done so, this accident could have been avoided, knowing the high likelihood that something like this could happen. But the truth is that in most armed conflicts, the countries involved rarely close their airspace. It's usually the airlines that decide not to fly over the area. And for this reason, to avoid this kind of accident, isn't it a good thing that airspaces have been closed at this moment when there's so much tension? Well, there's one last event that I think is quite important to remember and above all to report on. In 2021, something very strange happened that you surely remember. It's said that Belarus basically hijacked a Ryanair Boeing 737, but how did this happen? Well, the flight originally departed from Athens and was headed to Vilnius on board a Ryanair Boeing 737 with a local departure time of 7:29 anti-meridiem on May 23rd. However, around 9:26, an email was received from Hamas, supposedly claiming that there was a bomb on board, and that if Israel did not cease hostilities in Gaza, the device would be detonated once the plane was near Vilnius, Lithuania. This is the order of what happened. At 9:34 minutes after the email arrived, it was reported from the control. 4 minutes after the email arrived, the Belarusian air traffic control informed the Ryanair plane that there was information indicating they had an explosive device on board and recommended landing in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, since the email said it could explode if they approached Vilnius. From the Ryanair plane wanting to know its authenticity, they asked where that information came from. They were told that the information came from the airport where they had received the email. A few minutes later, the pilot is asked what decision he is going to make. But for that, the pilot asks, what is the color of the code? Green, yellow, amber, or red? And they tell him that the color is red. This indicates a serious and imminent threat. And this is when the pilot decides not to continue to Vilnius and to hold his position. 2 minutes later, the pilot declares Mayday and they report that they are proceeding to land in Minsk. This decision is communicated at 9:47 and 1 minute later. A Belarusian Mikoyan Gurevich, 29, is alerted to get ready and take off, but it doesn't. It doesn't take off until 10:04. Meanwhile, the Ryanair was heading towards Minsk, and during that time, it was given information on how and where to land. To which the pilots asked if Ryanair, the company, had already been informed about what was happening, since from the plane, they had no way to communicate with the airline. The air traffic controllers told them yes, that in 5 minutes they would notify Ryanair, and in the meantime, everything continued as normal. They landed at 10:15, and the pilots kept repeatedly asking if there was any information about the airline. They keep telling them no. Once everyone gets off the plane and they start searching for the explosive device, something unexpected happens. Roman Protasevich, a well-known journalist and activist against the Belarusian regime, is arrested. From the West, this was portrayed from the very beginning as a hijacking of the plane by Belarus, threatening with a MiG-29 loaded to the brim with missiles. That's why I've presented it that way too. However, when you look at the timeline left by the official International Civil Aviation Organization document below, you can see that the MiG-29, he was informed to go out and intercept the plane after the Ryanair pilots decided to land in Minsk. Mind you, I'm not saying it wasn't all a story made up by Belarus. The emails with the bomb threats were magically deleted and there was only a record of them through screenshots. Also, no one ever claimed responsibility for sending those emails. Honestly, it all sounds like it was planned by Belarus. However, at no point was the Ryanair threatened with the MiG-29. It's also important to mention that on many occasions there are incursions into enemy airspace by fighter jets. This is quite common in the Baltic between NATO and Russian fighter jets, or, well, rather, it used to be common when things were calmer. Nowadays, things could end very badly. One side decides to enter enemy airspace, and some fighter jets are sent out to intercept them. It has happened very frequently and nothing usually ever happens. But this also happens quite frequently between China and Taiwan, where the Chinese Air Force invades Taiwan's airspace. And it's said that in the future, China is likely to invade more frequently and cover more territory, each time until Taiwan has to respond by shooting down an aircraft, and use this as a pretext to start a conflict that would justify a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Thank you very much for watching this video. In the end, when a commercial plane is shot down, it's something terrible, and unfortunately, it has happened many more times than we've shown you in this video. But, of course, we wanted to show that both the United States and Russia have done this, because in many cases, when I've made a video where the United States comes off badly, I'm labeled as being pro-Russian. And when I make a video where Russia comes off badly, in the comments I'm labeled as being pro-American. Well, in this video, I don't know what's gonna happen, but it's always the same. When this happens in the end, it's always the victims who end up paying.